Christmas Eve at my parents' house in Newton always looks perfect from the outside, white lights on every window, a tree that could be in a magazine. The kind of polished dining room where nothing truly messy is ever allowed to exist. Inside, though, the air felt tight and cold, like everyone was holding their breath for the performance to start. I smoothed my dress with sweaty palms as my mother ushered us toward the table, her smile sharp as glass. "Dad, Mom, Sloan," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "This is Eli, my boyfriend." Sloan didn't bother hiding the way her eyes swept over him, his worn boots, his simple sweater. The fact that he didn't match their curated perfection. She smirked, lifted her wine glass, and said loudly, "Look at the family disappointment bringing that home." My parents nodded, amused, like it was just another joke. Eli just smiled, then said, "Interesting. Because you're about to be fired. And if you think that sentence is too cruel for a Christmas Eve, you should hear the Christmases that built it. It started decades ago, back when I was small enough to still believe Christmas was supposed to feel magical. I must have been 8, maybe 9. When I first understood that in the Reed household, magic was something manufactured, not something you felt, but something you performed. Every Christmas Eve, my mother dressed Sloan in a bright red velvet dress with a bow so large it looked like it could tip her over. She'd place her in front of the 12-foot tree, switch on the camcorder, and announce proudly to whoever was in the room, "And now, our little star." Sloan would sing a solo from whatever carol she had learned that winter, her voice sweet, shaky, but somehow always enough to make adults clap like they were witnessing prodigy. Meanwhile, I carried trays of gingerbread men from the kitchen to the guests, careful not to stain my plain white dress. When Mom needed someone to hold the camcorder steady, she handed it to me. "Ava, sweetie, get closer. You're cutting your sister's head off." When crumbs needed to be wiped, when wrapping paper needed to be gathered, when the dog peed on the tree skirt, I was the one quietly doing it while the adults cooed over our golden girl. Eyes of filled in redder. My mother, Karen, always had this way of fixing me with a smile that looked kind until you heard the words behind it. "Tuck your hair behind your ear, Ava. You look messy in pictures." Or, "Don't chatter too much, darling. Let Sloan shine, okay?" It wasn't an order, it was instruction, like she was arranging the set of a play, and I was a prop slightly out of place. I learned early that when Mom spoke in that soft, silky voice, what she really meant was, "Disappear a little more." My father, Thomas, wasn't as delicate. He didn't say things to hurt me, he said them because he didn't notice me enough to weigh whether they would. At every gathering, he talked about Sloane's ballet recitals, her choir solos, her straight-A report card. "She's the future of the Reed family," he would say, as though quoting a fact printed somewhere official. "That girl is going places." When a neighbor or a guest would politely ask about me, Dad's smile would flicker for half a second before he replied, "Ava? She's fine. Very sweet, always helping out." And that would be the end of it. They would nod, turn back to Sloan, and the spotlight would swing toward her again. Even as a child, I understood that in my family, being nice was code for being unremarkable. I didn't resent Sloan back then, I didn't know how. I simply learned, the way children do, through repetition, value equals visibility, love equals applause. And I was the one child no one clapped for. That's the thing no one tells you about favoritism. When you're young, it doesn't feel like hatred. It feels like being air. Like you could vanish, and the evening would continue, uninterrupted. One Christmas stands out sharper than the rest, the edges still stinging even now. At church, each kid in the children's choir was assigned a small part in the program. Sloan had her usual solo, of course, but I was assigned a short reading from the Gospel of Luke, just 8 lines. I practiced in my room for days, pacing the carpet, whispering each word like memorizing a spell. On the night of the performance, the sanctuary was warm and glowing with candles. I walked up to the lectern, knees shaking. My voice wasn't steady. By the 4th line, it cracked. By the 6th, I tripped over a word, Bethlehem, and had to start the sentence over. I could feel heat climbing up my neck and spreading across my cheeks. Afterwards, while parents congratulated their children, I approached my mother with hope that maybe she'd say, "Good job, sweetie." The same way she always did to Sloane. Instead, she touched my arm lightly and said, in that calm hostess voice she used for correcting mistakes in the kitchen, "I don't think public speaking is for you, Ava. It's okay. Some children just do better behind the scenes. Next time, we'll let Sloane handle it." That night, lying in my twin bed under snowflake-printed sheets, I stared at the ceiling and felt something small inside me fold in half. If my own mother thought I wasn't meant to be seen, why should anyone else think differently? The next year, when the church asked for volunteers for readings, I didn't raise my hand. When my aunt asked if I wanted to sing with the choir, I shook my head. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I stepped behind the camera for good. By the time I was 10, Christmas meant the same thing every year, Sloane glittering in center stage while I stood just out of frame, holding the camcorder or adjusting the ornaments or slicing the log cake. I didn't mind at first. It felt safe, and safety was what I thought love was supposed to feel like. But the more years that passed, the more the pattern hardened, the brighter Sloane shone, the more invisible I became. My mother's corrections became routine. "Lower your voice. Don't interrupt. Let guests talk to Sloane first," and my father's indifference became something I could predict by minute. I learned to shrink my laughter, so hers sounded prettier. I learned to wait until after guests arrived to change into the dress Mom picked for me, so they wouldn't comment on how plain I looked. I learned to adjust the lighting for photos, to hold the ladder while Dad placed the angel on the tree, to keep the dog calm, so it wouldn't jump on Sloane's dress. And, the most important lesson of all, I learned that Christmas wasn't a celebration, it was a production. A carefully choreographed show where every reed had a role. Sloane was the star. My parents were the directors. And I was the stagehand no one remembered to thank. By the time I reached high school, the Christmas patterns of my childhood had woven themselves into the fabric of our everyday life. Favoritism was no longer a seasonal performance, it was the operating system of the Reed household. And if childhood taught me to shrink, adolescence taught me that shrinking wasn't just expected, it was required to keep the peace. I wasn't a bad student. I wasn't exceptional either, at least not in the way my family measured excellence. I got A's and B's, kept out of trouble, joined a couple of clubs because guidance counselors told me colleges liked well-rounded kids. But none of it glittered. While I quietly enjoyed sketching layouts in the margins of my notebooks or tinkering with basic HTML on our old family computer, my parents saw those things as hobbies, cute, but unserious. Anytime they caught me at it, my father would raise an eyebrow and say, "Sweetheart, you know those creative internet things aren't real careers, right?" Meanwhile, Sloane was living inside a spotlight so bright it could have powered a small town. She was the captain of the cheerleading squad, on the student council, crowned homecoming princess junior year and prom queen the year after. Teachers adored her, coaches adored her, parents of other kids adored her. At school events, adults introduced her like she was some kind of rising celebrity art girl, the face of the future, that Reed daughter. I still remember the day I won a small design competition, a poster contest for a regional art program. The prize wasn't huge, just a certificate and a $50 gift card, but it felt enormous to me. It felt like, for once, something I loved doing mattered. I came home holding the envelope so proudly I didn't even take off my shoes before stepping into the living room. Dad was in his usual armchair, reading the paper. I waited until he looked up, my pulse beating against my ribs. "Dad, I won first place in a poster design competition," I said. "They're going to hang it in the school lobby for a month." He gave me a polite smile, the kind people give when a child hands them a drawing but they can't quite tell what it's supposed to be. "That's nice, Ava," he said. "But your sister has the regional speech competition next week. That'll be important for college. Make sure you support her." And just like that, the spark I felt dimmed. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was just a poster. Right? Nothing compared to the things Sloane was achieving. But I still folded the certificate into my desk drawer instead of hanging it up. When the time came for college applications, the divide between us widened into a canyon. I got accepted into a solid state university with a decent design program. I was proud. It felt right, creative, practical, affordable. When I told my parents at dinner, they nodded approvingly but casually, as though I had announced something predictable, like getting my driver's license renewed. A week later, Sloan announced she'd been accepted into one of the country's top private universities for marketing and communications. The reaction was cinematic. Champagne popped. Mom cried, happy tears. Dad made a toast about investing in brilliance. They emailed extended family before dessert. Then came the financial discussions. For Sloan, my parents didn't hesitate. We'll make it work, Dad said. A school like that is worth the debt. For me, the message was different. Ava, Mom said gently. You should choose a school that doesn't create unnecessary burden. State tuition is perfectly respectable. Translation. Sloan was allowed to be an investment. I needed to be economical. So, I worked. I found a part-time job at a cafe near campus, then added freelance design gigs here and there. I learned how to stretch $20 across 3 days. Eventually, when Dad's consulting work slowed down one semester, I even sent home small amounts from my paycheck to help with the bills, something they later credited to Sloan teaching you responsibility. Today's shins. Meanwhile, Sloan's allowance doubled because, as Mom put it, she needs to maintain her image in a big city. Image was something my family valued the way other families valued honesty or kindness. And image always meant Sloan. Coming home for Christmas during college became a ritualized reminder of that hierarchy. I'd drag my suitcase into the living room and see the walls transformed into a shrine dedicated to Sloan's achievements. Framed photos of her with her sorority, glossy prints of her advertising internship at a top agency, clippings of articles she'd written for campus publications. There were posters from school fundraisers she helped organize, awards from leadership conferences, and a giant collage my mother made of Sloan's year in review. Guests would walk in, see the display, and inevitably say, "Your daughter is extraordinary." And I would smile, standing there with my coat half unzipped. There was a corner reserved for me, too, a single side table near the staircase. On it sat a small frame with a photo of me holding a certificate that read, Employee of the Week, River Run Cafe. Mom had printed it from my Facebook post. Next to it was a candle, because she said the table looked empty otherwise. Sometimes I stared at that little frame longer than I should have, trying to convince myself that it didn't bother me. That I was proud of the work I did. That it didn't sting to know the world my parents showcased didn't have much space for me, but it did. It always did. By senior year, I had stopped expecting anything different. When family friends asked about my major, Dad would answer for me, graphic design. She's good at it, but you know how competitive those fields are. Then he'd pivot immediately to Sloan's latest big achievement, as if my life existed mainly to serve as a transition sentence. The favoritism wasn't subtle anymore, it was structural. It lived in every conversation, every decision, every dollar spent. It lived in the way they spoke to us, about us, and around us. And I learned to nod, smile, and make myself smaller so the imbalance wouldn't crack the family's carefully curated image. By the time I graduated, the world felt too big and too indifferent for someone like me, someone who had spent years being told, in ways loud and quiet, that her place was somewhere off to the side. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Boston, the kind where the kitchen sink was practically inside the shower and the radiator hissed like it held grudges. Still, it was mine. I filled it with thrifted furniture, printed my own posters for the walls, and told myself beginnings didn't have to look pretty to be real. My portfolio was good, better than good, if I allowed myself to be honest, but design is a field where talent is only half the equation. The other half is connections, introductions, referrals, all the things I didn't have. So, I worked part-time at a cafe, picked up whatever freelance gigs came my way. Logo redesigns for local shops, social media graphics for nonprofits, the occasional website layout for small businesses that could only pay half the invoice. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. Meanwhile, Sloan's career blossomed like a highlight reel. By the time I'd settled into my studio, she had already landed what she called her dream job at Brightline Collective, a fast-growing lifestyle brand that everyone on Instagram seemed obsessed with. She posted photos of the office glass walls, neon signs, kombucha on tap as though she lived inside a Pinterest board. Her job title sounded inflated, impressive, something like marketing and creative strategy lead. I didn't understand half of what it meant, but Dad talked about it like she'd been elected to Congress. Then, one afternoon, Dad called me with a voice full of forced casualness. The way he used to speak when he had arranged something for my own good. "Ava," he said, "Sloan tells me her company is looking for freelance designers. I shared your portfolio with her team. They might reach out. This could be a real opportunity for you if you try hard enough. Maybe they'll take you full-time." Is creased on, and I knew better than to read too deeply into the word opportunity. In my family, it usually meant, "This is the help you get, don't expect more." But I went to the interview anyway. I showed them my work, explained my process, answered their questions with the confidence I had practiced in the mirror. And, to my surprise, they hired me as a contractor. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, real experience. A foot in the door. For the first few months, I felt something close to hope. I worked under a manager named Julia who valued clarity and collaboration. She praised my attention to detail, trusted me with smaller campaigns, let me sit in brainstorm meetings even when contractors usually weren't invited. She once told me, "You think like a storyteller. That's rare." I carried that compliment around like a tiny flame cupped in my hands. But flames die quickly in drafts, and the draft arrived in the form of Sloan. About 4 months in, she was promoted some mix of charisma, optics, and Dad's network. I assumed to a position that gave her oversight of multiple teams, including the design projects I worked on. Suddenly, emails began ending with, "Looping in Sloan for review. Final approval will come from Sloan," or, "Sloan wants to adjust direction." It shouldn't have mattered. People get promoted. Workflows change. But the shift in power didn't just feel procedural, it felt personal. The first time something of mine disappeared into her orbit was during a pitch meeting. I wasn't invited, but Julia later told me the deck had landed well. "Your layout ideas really elevated the presentation," she said. "The team loved them." I froze. "My layout ideas?" She nodded. "Yes. The one Sloan presented as the new direction. The slide with the modular mock-ups? The color story you built?" My stomach dropped. Those were mine, my late-night sketches, my revisions, my iterations. But when Sloan mentioned them in the meeting, she called them team concepts, never once attaching my name. I told myself it wasn't worth overthinking. Maybe she forgot, maybe it was an oversight. Maybe if I worked harder, she'd give proper credit next time. Next time never came. The pattern grew sharper. Designs I'd sent for internal review would magically appear in polished decks. Sloan presented to leadership, stripped of my file names and layered into slides that bore her aesthetic. When I gently asked her about it over Slack, trying my hardest not to sound accusatory, she replied with a voice message that dripped with condescension. "Ava, sweetheart, you should be grateful. I'm giving you a chance most freelancers don't get. Don't get caught up in needing attention. Just focus on supporting the bigger picture." Supporting the bigger picture. In other words, stay invisible. Again. The breaking point came months later. When the company announced it was hiring a full-time designer, Julia encouraged me to apply. She said she'd recommend me. I stayed up until 3 a.m., perfecting my case study deck, rehearsing potential interview questions, crafting answers that showed growth and initiative. The interview went well, at least, it felt like it did. But when HR got back to me, the email was oddly vague, wrapped in corporate politeness. "We appreciate your contributions and talent but feel you may not be the best fit for the collaborative, high-pressure environment required for this role." I stared at the screen until the words doubled. Collaborative? High pressure? These were strengths Julia said she saw in me. So where had this assessment come from? Later, I learned through hushed office whispers that someone had told HR I struggled with anxiety, that I tended to break down under critique, that my emotional stability was a concern. The phrasing was almost clinical, coldly impersonal, except it matched the exact language Sloan used at home when she described me to relatives. "Ava gets overwhelmed easily. Ava doesn't handle stress well. Ava's sensitive." I haven't Russian readies. When I finally confronted Julia privately, she hesitated before saying, I didn't want to tell you this, but Sloane had input in the hiring decision. It felt like a fist curling inside my chest. Sloane? She nodded. HR consults her now for creative hires. She told them you weren't stable enough for a full-time role. I could barely breathe. I kept waiting for Julia to say she was exaggerating, that I had misunderstood, that this wasn't what it sounded like. But she didn't. And in that moment, I understood something brutal and undeniable. I had not been overlooked. I had been blocked, deliberately, systematically, by my own sister. I thought about going to my parents, about telling them that their star child had quietly sabotaged me again and again. But I knew exactly how that conversation would go. Ava, don't be jealous. Ava, don't twist things. Ava, you're lucky your sister even tried to help. Danzig, I unin end of fin. So, I stayed silent, swallowed the hurt, and kept working as a contractor because rent needed to be paid and dreams didn't build themselves. But something inside me shifted, then just a hairline crack, nothing dramatic. A whisper that asked, why does she get to decide who you are? I didn't have an answer yet. Not then. But that crack would become a fault line, and eventually, the whole structure of our family dynamic would split wide open. Losing the full-time role hadn't been the sharp, cinematic heartbreak you see in movies. It was quieter than that, slower, like erosion. Like something wearing me down grain by grain until one morning I woke up and realized I no longer recognized the shape of my own confidence. After Brightline passed on me, the freelance work I'd been depending on grew more irregular. A few retainer clients paused their contracts. One long-term partnership fell through because the startup shut down overnight. Another large project, a branding package that was supposed to cover 2 months of rent, was canceled without warning, leaving me staring at an empty inbox and a landlord who didn't care about unexpected delays in payment. I paid half the rent late, apologized, promised to catch up, then skipped meals for a week to make the numbers work. Those weeks blurred together into a gray haze. I woke up anxious, went to bed anxious, and lived the hours in between with a strange, buzzing exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. I regretted trusting my family's connection, regretted joining Brightline under Sloane's shadow, regretted believing just for a moment that I might finally be seen. And then came Christmas. The Christmas that broke something open. I hadn't planned to go home that year, but Mom's texts grew relentless. Ava, everyone expects you here. We're a family. Don't make us look divided. And because I was tired, too tired to fight, I packed a bag, caught a train, and arrived at the Reed House in Newton feeling like a guest in a museum exhibit of my own childhood. Dinner that night was exactly what I should have expected, a curated highlight reel of Sloane's brilliance. My parents had invited neighbors, colleagues, their church friends. The dining table glowed under the chandelier as Mom performed her role as the perfect hostess, gliding between seats, refilling glasses, telling stories about Sloane's promotions, Sloane's travel, Sloane's accomplishments. I sat at the edge of the conversation, smiling when appropriate, laughing softly when expected. My plate grew cold. At one point, Karen turned to me with a sweet, pitying smile, the kind that always felt both soft and sharp. Ava, dear, are you still doing those online design things? When will you get a real job? The table chuckled politely, as if she'd made a harmless joke. My throat tightened, but before I could answer, Dad added his own blow, delivered casually, almost bored. You should take after your sister. She doesn't settle. She knows how to rise above being average. Average. Middle. Forgettable. The word average hit harder than anything else, maybe because it didn't accuse me. It erased me. I pushed back from the table soon after, claiming a headache, and walked upstairs to the room I grew up in. The wallpaper was still a faded pattern of stars, chosen when I was 10. My childhood trophies, participation medals, not the real kind, still lined the shelf, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to panic rise inside me, thick and suffocating. I sat on the floor, back against the bed frame, and cried so hard it hurt. Not delicate tears heaving, gasping sobs that clawed their way out of me. I cried because I felt small, because every voice that mattered to me had agreed, in quiet and loud ways, that I wasn't enough. I cried because a part of me believed them. Because the child who once stepped off a church stage in shame was still living inside me, still begging someone to say she was worth seeing. I don't know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the house to quiet. Long enough to hear my parents downstairs laughing with guests. Long enough to feel a different kind of grief settle in, a grief not for who I was, but for who I'd been taught to be. When I returned to Boston, I didn't bounce back. I couldn't. Anxiety wrapped itself around my ribs. I had trouble eating, trouble sleeping. My hands shook when I opened my laptop, like my body flinched at the idea of trying again only to fail. A coworker at the cafe, someone kind and observant, noticed the way I kept zoning out during shifts. One night, as we closed up, she touched my arm gently and said, "Ava, you don't have to go through this alone. Therapy helped me when I felt like I was drowning." I don't know why I listened. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, someone seemed to care without expecting anything back. Therapy didn't fix me overnight. But it did give me language. Words like scapegoat child, gaslighting, and familial favoritism. Terms that felt clinical, but hit with the force of revelation. I learned that what I'd interpreted as personal failure was, in many ways, a system. A pattern. A story I had been assigned long before I had the chance to write my own lines. I remember sitting across from my therapist one afternoon as she gently asked, "Ava, when did you first learn that your needs weren't important?" And something in me fractured. Because I knew the answer immediately. I had always known. But naming it was like turning on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through my whole life. Slowly, painfully, I began to untangle myself from the belief that everything was my fault. That I deserved the scraps of attention, the minimized opportunities, the quiet dismissals. By the time the next Christmas approached, I knew I couldn't go back. Couldn't sit at that table again. Couldn't allow myself to shrink for the sake of keeping the peace. When my mother called, her tone was clipped with irritation disguised as concern. "Ava, people are asking where you'll be for the holidays. It's embarrassing when my own daughter doesn't show up. Are you really not coming?" For the first time in my life, I didn't bend. For the first time, I said the words I had spent decades swallowing. "I need space, Mom." Silence crackled across the line. Not confusion, offense. Then she exhaled sharply and said, "Well, do what you want." And I did. I spent Christmas alone in my tiny studio, drinking hot chocolate from a chipped mug, wrapped in a blanket, not performing for anyone. It didn't feel joyful, it didn't feel triumphant, but it felt honest. And honesty, I would later realize, was the first small step toward transformation. Toward someone who could eventually look at a man like Eli and believe she might be worth loving. Toward someone who could stand at a Christmas table years later and finally refuse to play the role she had been assigned. Meeting Eli didn't feel like meeting a future boyfriend. It didn't even feel like meeting someone important. It felt accidental. The way turning a corner and finding sunlight feels accidental. I was still fragile, then patchworked together with therapy sessions, late-night journaling, and the quiet vow I'd made to myself not to return to the life that had broken me. I wasn't ready for anything big. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was simply trying to stay afloat. The workshop came through a small scholarship I'd applied for at the last minute, more out of desperation than confidence. UX for social impact, the flyer said. I almost didn't go. I almost convinced myself I'd be out of place, that everyone there would be better, more experienced, more charismatic, more deserving. But something in me, some tiny rebellious ember, told me I needed to show up to something that wasn't about survival. So I went. The workshop was held in a repurposed industrial loft in Cambridge, brick walls softened by string lights and whiteboards full of sticky notes. I remember clutching my notebooks so tightly my knuckles hurt. And then Eli walked in, not with the swagger of a polished tech executive, but with an easy, almost self-effacing calm. He wore a gray sweater, dark jeans, and sneakers that looked like he'd actually walked in them, not curated them. He introduced himself as someone who started a few things that didn't fail, then accidentally became a consultant. Half the room laughed. I didn't, because I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be funny. But he didn't seem bothered. Throughout the session, Eli floated around the room, listening more than he spoke, nodding thoughtfully, occasionally offering a suggestion that didn't sound like correction, more like invitation. When he reached my table, I felt myself tense, not visibly, but enough that I had to force my shoulders to drop. Men like him, successful, articulate, had never been safe spaces for me. They had always reminded me of my father, charming when they wanted to be, dismissive when you needed them not to be. But Eli was nothing like that. He didn't ask for my background or my resume. He didn't try to dominate the conversation. Instead, he looked at the messy wireframe sketches I'd been working on and said, "You think in systems. Most designers think in shapes. That's rare." I blinked at him, unsure how to respond. "It's not rare," I mumbled. "I just overthink everything." "It's not a Jersey. Overthinking is just deep thinking that hasn't met the right problem yet," he said, shrugging lightly, like it was the most obvious truth in the world. No one had ever framed one of my supposed flaws as a strength before. As the workshop went on, Eli asked questions the way good designers do, curiously, gently, with genuine interest instead of judgment. And every time I downplayed myself, he raised an eyebrow in this subtle, quiet way that felt like a request to look again, to reconsider the story I was telling about myself. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed again, first because he was assigned as a mentor to my project group, then because he invited the team out for coffee, then because he stayed after one session to talk about user research methods with me. None of it felt romantic. It felt safe. Like the first time in years someone wasn't waiting for me to shrink. Eventually, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee one-on-one to talk through some ideas for my portfolio. We sat in a small cafe near Kendall Square, both of us sipping lattes that went cold as the conversation wandered. I found myself telling him bits of my life carefully, cautiously, always with disclaimers. "My family means well," I said once, stirring my drink long after the foam had dissolved. I think a lot of the problems were my fault. I wasn't confident enough. Or ambitious enough, or something enough. He watched me for a long moment, fingers loosely wrapped around his mug. Then he asked, in the softest voice I'd heard anyone use with me, "Ava, are you sure those were your faults? Or were you taught to think they were?" The question hit me so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. No judgment. No advice. Just a mirror gently angled toward me. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. Eli didn't push. He just nodded, as though he understood that silence was sometimes the first step toward truth. Little by little, we spent more time together working on a small UX side project, grabbing dinner after long days, walking along the Charles River when the weather wasn't terrible. I noticed he never asked invasive questions. Never acted like he was entitled to my story. Never tried to fix me. Instead, he encouraged small boundaries. You don't have to reply to every message right away. It's okay to say you're busy. Rest is work too. When I told him my mother expected daily check-ins, he shook his head gently. "Why?" "Because she says it's respectful." "And does she check in with you daily?" "No." He smiled. "Then it's not about respect, it's about control." Hearing someone say that out loud felt like pulling a thread that had been knotted for years. Then one day, he forwarded me a job listing from a small mental health tech startup a founder he occasionally advised needed a product designer. "You don't have to apply," he wrote, "but I think you'd be great for it." I applied. I interviewed. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't competing with my sister's shadow. When the offer came, a real salary, real benefits, a team that listened when I spoke, I cried. Not because I felt lucky, but because I finally felt something closer to deserving. The first day I walked into that startup office, scrappy and imperfect and full of potential, I felt more seen than I ever had at Brightline, or at home, or even in college. I told Eli about the offer over dinner. He grinned, not proud, not triumphant, but warm. "You did that," he said. "Not me." "You helped," I whispered. He shook his head. "I just pointed at doors. You're the one who walked through them." Also, it was subtle, slow. Nothing like the dramatic turning points people like to frame in stories. But it mattered. Because somewhere along those coffee dates and long work nights and quiet conversations, something inside me shifted. I didn't become a different person. I didn't suddenly become confident or fearless, but I stopped seeing myself as the family disappointment. I started seeing myself as someone who might deserve more than the role I'd been assigned. And that shift, small as it was, would become the foundation for everything that came next. For standing up to my family. For refusing to shrink again. For facing the explosion that Christmas Eve would become. And for finally believing I was worth loving. By the time autumn rolled into Boston cold mornings, early sunsets, the Charles River turning the color of steel, my life felt steadier than it had in years. I had a stable job, a team that respected me, and someone beside me who didn't treat my quietness like a flaw to fix. Therapy was helping. Boundaries were helping. Eli was helping. Not by saving me, but by standing close enough that I could finally hear my own voice. And then, one afternoon at a cafe in downtown Crossing, something shifted subtly at first, almost invisibly, like the faintest tremor before an earthquake. We were sitting across from each other, laptops open, both of us lost in our work. I leaned over to point at something on his screen. He'd asked my opinion on a user flow for a mobile app, and that's when I saw it, a small email notification popping up in the corner. A logo. Brightline Collective. Sloan's company. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I laughed, awkward and light, trying to brush off the jolt in my chest. Wait, I teased, nudging him lightly with my elbow. You're consulting for Brightline too? Should I be concerned? Is my sister your next client? Eli didn't look startled, or guilty, or evasive. He simply closed the notification, took a sip of his coffee, and said, I join a few meetings here and there. They've been going through some organizational transitions, so I'm helping assess things. I didn't think twice about it. Companies hired outside consultants all the time. It made sense that Eli, who had built and sold startups before, would be pulled into different projects. Still, something about the way he phrased organizational transitions tugged at my curiosity, but I didn't push. I was still learning how not to assume that every coincidence was a warning. That night, though, the coincidence returned with teeth. My phone rang just as I was settling into bed. The caller ID flashed Sloan. I thought briefly about ignoring it, but old habits die hard. I answered. Her voice was sharp, impatient, the way it always was when she needed something. Ava, I need a few quick design mock-ups for a partnership we're pitching. You can turn them around by tomorrow morning, right? It's just a favor. Sister to sister. My stomach tightened. Sloan, I have a full-time job now. I don't really freelance anymore. She scoffed. Come on. Don't be like that. I told my team I had a designer on standby, and it would look really bad if you bail. And don't start talking about money you know you owe me for getting you into Brightline in the first place. I felt the familiar spin of guilt and self-doubt tightening, like a rope around my throat. I don't think I. Listen, she snapped, if you can't even help me with this, don't blame me when I tell Dad how ungrateful you've been. I'm trying to include you, Ava. Don't make it so hard. There it was again, the old script. Threat wrapped in faux generosity. I hung up feeling small, twisted, tired. The next day, Eli noticed immediately that something was wrong. We met for lunch near my office, and he watched me pick at my food without saying a word until I finally sighed and explained haltingly, awkwardly what had happened. I expected him to shrug, or to say something detached like, families are complicated. But instead, he set his fork down very slowly and asked, does she do this often? Call you only when she needs something? I laughed, embarrassed. Well, yeah. But it's fine, that's just how we are. I mean, she helped me get work once, kind of. And I think I owe her, maybe? Eli's gaze sharpened not with anger, but with focus. Ava. Is this about owing her? Or is this about being afraid of seeming ungrateful? I swallowed. Hard. Maybe both. Eyes. I wasn't prepared for how quietly he said, tell me more. So I did. For the first time, I told someone the full story, not just the sad parts I'd learned to laugh off, but the truth, how Sloan had taken credit for my work. How she had undermined my chance at a full-time role. How HR had repeated her exact words when rejecting me. When I finished, Eli's expression wasn't pity. It wasn't outrage, it was restrained fury. But not at me. Ava, he said softly, did you keep any of those emails? The ones where she took credit for your designs? Or the HR communications about the role? I frowned. Some of them, I think. And your contract back then, what did it actually say about ownership of your work? I'd have to check. He nodded slowly. Do that. I blinked. Why? You're not planning on. I'm not doing anything, he said. But you deserve to understand the facts. Not the story you were fed. That night, I dug through old folders, digital and physical, and pulled out everything related to my time at Brightline. Emails, Slack screenshots, design drafts with my metadata still intact. I sent them to Eli, apologizing twice in the message for taking up his time. He replied with one sentence. You're not taking anything from me. You're giving yourself clarity. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Life continued: work, therapy, dinners with Eli, quiet weekends. But sometimes, when we talked about design ethics or workplace fairness, he asked oddly specific questions about how Brightline had been structured, how decisions were made, how Sloan interacted with her team. At the time, I thought he was just curious. I didn't know those questions were puzzle pieces. I didn't know he was assembling them. One evening in November, as we walked back to my apartment through cold wind and early Christmas lights, Eli said something that made me pause mid-step. Ava, he murmured, if someone uses their authority to choke another person's career, especially someone in their own family, that's not just bad behavior. That's an ethical violation. And, sometimes, it has consequences. I didn't understand then. Not fully. I thought he was speaking in hypotheticals, offering me comfort in some philosophical way. I didn't know he meant it literally. I didn't know that the man walking beside me, the man who listened, the man who asked gentle questions, was the same man quietly leading an internal investigation into Sloan's division after his company acquired Brightline. I didn't know that the evidence I gave him was already tipping the scales. At the time, all I knew was this. When Eli said things like that, my chest didn't knot with fear. It loosened. For the first time in my life, someone didn't tell me to forgive my family. He told me to see the truth, and the truth was inching closer, piece by piece, toward the moment everything would finally break open. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening in early December, just as the first real snow of the season began to powder the sidewalks outside my apartment. I was chopping vegetables for dinner. Eli was coming over later, something simple, something warm, when my phone buzzed with the familiar name, Mom. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out. I had gotten good at that over the past year, pausing, breathing, deciding. But some parts of you never fully unlearn that reflex to pick up, to obey, to keep the peace. So I answered. Karen's voice came through sugar-sweet and brittle, like frosting over cold glass. Ava, darling. I'm glad I caught you. Listen. This year the whole family is expecting a Christmas Eve gathering. I already told everyone you'll be there. A pause, sharpened with expectation. Don't make me look foolish. You know how people talk. My grip on the phone tightened. When my mother said people, she meant their neighbors in Newton, Dad's old partners, the church women who monitored social media more closely than scripture. She meant image, appearance, the flawless Reed family photo. Before I could respond, Dad's voice cut in from the background, and a moment later, he was on speaker. Ava, I hope you understand this isn't optional. I've invited a few colleagues and Pastor Mitchell will stop by. It would reflect poorly if your sister is the only child who ever shows up. So there it was. The real reason. Not love, not longing, optics. My voice faltered. I haven't decided yet. I have work and… Ava, Mom interrupted, her tone cooling. Don't start. It's Christmas. And you've had plenty of time to prepare. Your sister will be there. She always makes time for family. I felt that hit, low and familiar. The comparison. The implication. The ever-present reminder that my presence was not about me. It was about completing a picture. When the call ended, I stood silently in my kitchen, knife still in hand, the yellow bell pepper half cut on the board. The room felt smaller. The past year growth, Therapy, boundaries felt suddenly fragile, like a snow globe someone had just shaken too hard. When Eli arrived, he took one look at me and said, "What happened?" I told him haltingly at first, then in a rush the whole conversation, every carefully crafted guilt blade embedded in my mother's tone. How a part of me wanted to refuse, wanted to protect my peace. But another part, a quieter, wounded part, wanted to go. Wanted to stand in that house, not as the fragile girl I had once been, but as someone new, someone different, someone bolder. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I want to prove to myself that I'm not her version of me. But I'm scared. They always know exactly where to hit. And I don't want to bring you into something ugly." Eli leaned against the counter, arms crossed but expression soft. "Let me ask you something." I nodded. "Do you want to go because you choose to? Or because they want you there?" The question sat in the air like a held breath. I swallowed. I want to close the loop. To walk into that house and not feel like a ghost. But yes, I'm also afraid. Afraid they'll humiliate me. Afraid they'll disrespect you. They've done it before to other people I cared about. His eyes softened in a way that made my chest ache. "You're scared because you know what they're capable of. That doesn't make you weak." I exhaled shakily. "If they turn on me again, I don't know if I can hold it together." "We don't have to stay," Eli said. "If it gets bad, we leave. Immediately. No apologies. No explanations. To start an Isoltan example, divide Wayne, and I weigh." "But Mom will say I overreacted," I whispered. And Dad will say I embarrassed them. And Sloan will say I'm dramatic." "Okay." He stepped closer, tilting his head to catch my gaze. "Ava, if leaving is the right thing for you, we leave. And you don't get to punish yourself for it. That's the agreement. You hear me?" It took me a moment to process the weight of what he was giving me, permission to choose myself. Something my family had never allowed. Something I had never allowed myself. I nodded slowly. "Okay?" He smiled faintly, relief flickering behind it. "Good. Then we go on your terms." There was a small silence, warm rather than heavy. Then Eli added, almost casually but with a gleam I didn't yet understand. "Besides, I have a few things I should probably settle with someone there. This might be the right time." I blinked, confused. "Settle what? With who?" He shrugged, keeping his voice light. "Nothing serious. Just follow-up conversations." At the time, I interpreted that as normal pre-meeting jitters, like he wanted to make a good impression on my parents or ensure he didn't say the wrong thing. I even smiled, nerves easing slightly. "You don't have to impress them," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's not really what this is." I didn't understand the meaning behind those words yet. I didn't see the quiet calculation in his eyes, or how carefully he was choosing what to reveal. I was so focused on my own fear, the fear of shrinking again, that I missed the clues right in front of me. If I had been paying closer attention, maybe I would have noticed the subtle way he'd been organizing information these past weeks. The Brightline logo on his screen. The questions about my old emails. The quiet, measured concern when I told him about the way Sloan spoke to me. The strange phrase, organizational transitions. The almost protective intensity when he said workplace abuse had consequences. But I wasn't looking for a twist. I wasn't looking for anything but a familiar house I wanted one final chance to face without breaking. So I nodded, let him take my hand, and agreed to return to the place that had shaped my wounds. On my terms, not theirs. At least, that's what I believed then. I had no idea the storm waiting inside that house. Or that Eli wasn't just coming as my support, but as the bearer of truth that would shatter everything the Reed family had carefully built. Christmas Eve at my parents' house in Newton, Massachusetts, always looked like something out of a magazine, soft golden lights glowing through frosted windows. A tree positioned perfectly in the bay window, the entire dining room staged like a lifestyle photo shoot. But the truth was that Christmas Eve in the Reed household had never felt like a homecoming. It felt like stepping back onto a stage where every line, every expression, every breath had already been assigned long before I walked through the door. This year was no different. If anything, the performance was grander than usual. When Eli and I arrived, The driveway was full. Dad's former law partners, Mom's church friends, the neighbors with the picture-perfect children, a few of Sloane's colleagues. Every single person who had ever admired the Reed family brand was present. And, of course, Mom greeted us at the door with a smile stretched too tight, her eyes scanning me as if checking whether I met the dress code for her illusion. Christmas Eve at my parents' house. I whispered to myself as we stepped inside, always feels more like a stage than a home. It's liked by Eli, in his simple wool coat and slightly worn boots, looked almost out of place among the pressed suits and sparkling heels. I squeezed his hand once, quietly grateful he didn't seem fazed by any of it. I hadn't brought anyone home in 3 years, and the weight of that hung at the back of my throat. The dining table was already surrounded by guests when Dad waved us forward. Crystal glasses, folded linen napkins, perfect centerpieces of winter berries and candles. The entire room hummed with a kind of curated warmth that never reached my skin. I forced myself to stand tall. "Dad, Mom, Sloane," I said, steadying my voice. "This is Eli, my boyfriend." The entire table paused to take him in. And then Sloane, glittering in a designer dress, her lipstick sharp, her smile sharper, lifted her wine glass and gave him a once-over so slow and so deliberate it felt like a slap. "Oh wow," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. Classic Ava, always bringing home the safe, small things. "Look at this guy," he practically screams, family disappointment. "How fitting." A few people chuckled, Dad smirked. Mom gave an apologetic but not really apologetic shrug, murmuring, "Ava's always been different, you know. Not like Sloane. But she's sweet, in her own way." Thomas chimed in, patting Manny from the country club on the shoulder. "Ava never takes risks. Guess her boyfriend's the same, safe, predictable, nothing ambitious." Eyes, Susan in a vitty. Heat crept up my neck. I felt myself shrinking, the old reflex coming back like muscle memory. I had promised myself I wouldn't disappear tonight. I had promised Eli I wouldn't, but humiliation has a way of reaching straight back into your childhood and pulling you under. I smiled weakly, an instinct. Not a choice. And Eli squeezed my hand under the table. Not to comfort me, but as if to ask, "Are you still choosing yourself?" That tiny pressure kept me from collapsing inward. He didn't falter. Didn't blush. Didn't retreat. Instead, after a few minutes of forced small talk and thinly veiled insults, he gently set his glass on the table. The sound was soft but sharp enough to cut through the chatter. "It's interesting," he said calmly, his voice carrying with unsettling ease. "Hearing people speak with such authority about success and failure." The room quieted. Sloane froze mid-sip. Eli leaned back slightly, his gaze cool, almost clinical. Especially coming from someone who's about to receive an employment termination notice after the holidays. Silence exploded. Sloane blinked. What are you talking about?" Mom's chair screeched. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are, coming into my home making threats?" Dad pushed back from the table, jaw taut. "Young man, you have no idea what you're saying. And if you're implying legal action, I strongly suggest you reconsider." Eli didn't even look at them. His eyes stayed locked on Sloane. Then, calm as ever, he reached into his coat, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and slid a card across the table. Next, he placed a sealed envelope on top of it. "Let me introduce myself properly," he said. "My name is Eli Grant. I'm co-founder and chief strategy officer of the Grant and Lewis Group, the parent company that acquired Brightline Collective 6 months ago." The color drained from Sloane's face. Around us, gasps erupted. Conversations halted. Chairs shifted as people craned their necks. Eli tapped the envelope. "And this is a copy of the internal investigation report regarding misconduct within your department." Mom sputtered. "Misconduct? My daughter would never." Dad snapped. "This is outrageous. What kind of stunt is this?" Eli opened the envelope, pulled out the first page, and read calmly. "Repeated instances of abusing managerial authority. Intimidation of subordinates. Taking credit for work belonging to contractors, including 1A, Reed. Collusion with external vendors. Undisclosed gifts, attempts to influence hiring decisions using personal relationships. He set the page down. There's more. A lot more. Whispers rippled through the room. Sloane shot to her feet. This is a lie. Ava put you up to this. She's jealous. She's always been jealous. She's trying to ruin me. I felt my heart beating against my ribs. Old fear rose inside me. Old guilt. Old instinct to apologize, to fix things I didn't break. But then Eli's earlier promise echoed in my mind. Don't shrink again. Not this time. So I stood too. No, Sloane, I said, voice trembling but loud enough. I didn't try to ruin you. I filed grievances because you sabotaged my work, because you stole my ideas, because you told HR I wasn't mentally stable enough for a job I earned. The room went silent. I looked directly at her, maybe for the first time in my life, without flinching. You didn't just hurt me as a sister. You hurt me professionally. You used our family dynamic to justify abusing your authority. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Eli stepped beside me, but not in front of me. Not shielding, standing with. And for the record, he told the room. The investigation started long before I knew Ava and Sloane were related. The anonymous complaint with documentation and time-stamped files was the catalyst. Someone named A. Reed sent it. I didn't know who that was at the time. Mom clasped her chest. Ava, how could you? Families don't hurt their own. Dad pointed at me, fury tightening his voice. You've destroyed your sister's career. You're tearing this family apart. I inhaled shakily once, twice, and then the truth rose up inside me, clear and sharp. I'm not destroying anything, I said. I'm just refusing to let you destroy me. I looked straight at my parents. You called me mediocre, average, disappointment. Even tonight, before I said a word, you mocked me. You mocked Eli. You've done it my whole life. And when Sloane took credit for my work, when she blocked my job, when she lied to HR, you told me to be grateful. My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. If you need a villain to keep your family story neat, I won't be that for you anymore. Then I placed my napkin on the table with quiet finality. I'm done performing. My hands shook. But I felt taller than I ever had. I turned to Eli. Can we go? He nodded, sliding the envelope back toward Sloane. Our company lawyers will follow up after the holidays, he said. Merry Christmas. And with that, we walked out past the stunned guests. Past the perfect decorations, past the home where I had learned to be small. As the cold air hit my face outside, something inside me cracked open, not in pain, but in release. I wasn't the disappointment. I wasn't the problem. I wasn't the support character in the Reed family narrative. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And I wasn't going back. The drive back to Boston that night felt unreal, as if Eli and I were suspended between two different versions of my life, the one I had just walked out of, and the one I hadn't fully stepped into yet. Snow fell in slow, quiet sheets across the windshield, blurring the world outside, giving everything a muted softness that didn't match the storm still spinning inside my chest. My hands trembled in my lap as Eli drove. I kept replaying the scene at the dining table, each word echoing louder than it had in the moment. Part of me felt sick, truly sick, at the idea that Sloane might actually lose her job. That my grievance report, never intended to hurt her, had unearthed everything she had tried to hide. The guilt came in waves. What if it was my fault? What if I went too far? What if speaking up made me cruel? These thoughts clung stubbornly, the same way they had my entire life. But beneath them, beneath the panic and the shaking, there was also something else. Something unfamiliar. A fragile, breathtaking sense of air returning to a place inside me that had been sealed shut. Freedom. Eli kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. He didn't try to pry, didn't say empty reassuring things like, you did the right thing, or, don't feel bad. He let me sit with all of it, my guilt, my disbelief, my strange lightness. After several minutes, he reached over, took my hand gently, and said only, whatever you're feeling right now is allowed. That simple sentence cracked me open. The next morning is when the messages began. Karen texted first. Then again. Then 20 times after that. You've murdered your sister's career. It stands of the tossed. No one in a family treats each other like this. I didn't raise you to become this cold, heartless stranger. If you have even an ounce of heart, you'll call your sister right now. Every message was a dagger dipped in guilt, honed over decades. I stared at my phone until my vision blurred, then put it face down on the counter. The screen lit up again almost instantly. Dad called Eli directly. I didn't know until Eli showed me the voicemail, matter of fact, like handing me evidence rather than dropping a bomb. Mr. Grant, my father's voice snapped. This is Thomas Reed. I am advising you to prepare for legal consequences. Your reckless accusations have endangered my daughter's professional reputation. You have no authority to speak to her employment status. I strongly recommend you have your attorneys reach out. Eli's only reaction was a slow exhale through his nose. Then he pressed call back, and before I could panic, he spoke clearly, firmly. Mr. Reed, this matter will proceed through corporate legal channels. All findings are documented. If you wish to challenge them, please contact the Grant and Lewis Legal Department. I will not be engaging with you personally, going forward. He hung up before my father could respond. I felt a mix of awe and fear. No one had ever spoken to my father like that, not without being steamrolled. And certainly not on my behalf. But the worst came from Sloan. Voicemail after voicemail. Text after text. Paragraphs so long I had to scroll to finish them. You're a snake. You've always been jealous. I hope you're happy ruining me. You pretend to be this quiet, innocent victim, but you're a manipulator, a fraud. You think Eli actually cares? He'll leave you the minute he realizes how pathetic you are. The words shouldn't have surprised me. But somehow, they still cut, because once upon a time, I would have done anything, absolutely anything to protect her, to earn even an ounce of her approval. I blocked her. Unblocked her. Read more messages. Blocked her again. My hands shook as I finally decided to write one last message, not to argue, not to defend myself, but to end the cycle. Sloan, I didn't file a report to hurt you. I filed it because I deserved fairness, and because the way you used your position harmed more than just me. I'm not apologizing for asking to be treated with basic respect. Whatever happens next is the result of your choices, not mine. This will be my last message. I need distance. I hit send, then I blocked her for good. In therapy later that week, I told my therapist everything: the confrontation, the guilt, the constant voice whispering that maybe I had gone too far. What if I'm becoming the person they always said I was? I asked, cold, selfish, cruel. What if I'm proving them right? She looked at me with the kind of gentleness that makes you feel seen and steady at the same time. Ava, she said, the consequences someone experiences because they harmed others do not make you the cruel one. Accountability is not cruelty. It's clarity. I let that sink in. It felt like trying on a jacket that almost fit but not yet comfortably. Asking for fairness was not violence. She continued, but what your family did to you for decades, that was violence. Emotional violence. And choosing not to accept it anymore is not betrayal. It is survival. I cried harder than I expected. In the days that followed, Eli didn't push me to heal quickly or pretend everything was fine. He cooked simple meals: soup, roasted vegetables, pasta, and sat with me on the couch while I processed. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes we walked around the snowy streets in silence until the cold bit our cheeks red. He was present without hovering. One night, after I apologized for being so emotionally messy, he cupped my cheeks and said softly, Ava, I don't love you because you're resilient or because you've learned to endure pain. I love you because you chose courage, even when it terrified you. That's not messy. That's extraordinary. Ice did endure. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I didn't recognize at first: space. Breathing room, the outline of a life that might actually belong to me. That afternoon, I stood in my living room and stared at the wall where I'd hung family photos for years. Photos that told only half the story: the curated half, the smiling half, the half that made everyone think we were perfect. I took them down, one by one, frame by frame, memory by memory. I kept only a few, One of me laughing with friends from my design team. One of Eli and me standing in front of a food truck. One of myself alone taken on a hike I'd done last fall. In that photo, my hair was windblown, my cheeks flushed, and my smile unforced. That was the life I wanted to build. That was the person I wanted to be. Not the Reed family disappointment. Not the girl in the background. Not the scapegoat, just Ava. Becoming someone new. 1 year became 2 before I even realized how far I'd traveled from the version of myself who walked out of my parents' house that night. Healing doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, like fresh snow layering over old footprints. By the time I looked up, the landscape of my life had changed so completely, it was hard to believe I had ever lived another way. My new apartment in Boston wasn't large, just a one-bedroom walk-up near the river, but it was mine in a way no space had ever been before. Warm-toned lamps instead of glaring overhead lights. Shelves of books I loved, not ones chosen to impress visitors. A gallery wall of my own posters and UX concepts. Plants that somehow survived under my inconsistent care, a thrifted velvet couch in deep green. The place felt lived in, soft, and unapologetically me. No Reed family aesthetic. No pressure to curate a facade. It was the first home that didn't require performance. Career-wise, I had grown more quickly than I ever expected. The small startup Eli introduced me to bloomed, and with it, opportunities I had once feared asking for. Within 2 years, I'd become a lead product designer, working on a mental health app aimed at helping young adults manage anxiety and family stress. It felt poetic building tools I wish I'd had at 16 or 22, or even the night I walked away from my parents' house shaking. For the first time, my work didn't feel like a fight for recognition. It felt meaningful. My old family lived at a distance now, not geographically, but emotionally. Newton was still only a short drive away, but the gap between who I used to be there and who I had become here was immeasurable. And from what I could tell, the Reed performance machine had started to rust. Mom and Dad posted far less on social media. No more elaborate family photo Christmas cards. No more captions about our perfect daughters. People whispered neighbors, church groups, Dad's old colleagues. The stories spread in the small, affluent circles they cared about. Sloan Reed had been terminated after an internal ethics investigation. They tried to spin it at first a misunderstanding, corporate restructuring, politics. But the truth clung stubbornly. Reputation, once cracked, rarely mends cleanly. Sloan drifted from one marketing job to another, each role smaller than the last. Her Instagram became a curated highlight reel of expensive coffee and motivational quotes, but people who knew her said she wasn't the same, more brittle, more defensive, constantly blaming that witch of a sister for her downfall. I didn't seek those updates, but Boston is a small city with very talkative corners. Every few months, Mom sent a long, rambling email. Always the same melody in slightly different lyrics. I only want what's best for you. This has all gone way too far. Why don't you come home for Christmas this year? The family needs to heal. But not once, not one single time, did she acknowledge the favoritism, the manipulation, the years of gaslighting. Not one apology for dismissing me, for elevating Sloan at my expense, for letting me believe I was the problem. So I replied simply, I wish you both peace. But I will no longer come back just to be the background in anyone else's story. I sent that same sentence every time. Eventually, the emails became less frequent. And then December came again, my new December. Instead of a cold performance in a too-perfect dining room, I filled my small apartment with the warm chaos of people I actually chose. Coworkers who couldn't fly home, neighbors whose families lived across the ocean, friends who had become a patchwork family of their own. We cooked together imperfect, joyful meals. Someone burned the yams, someone spilled cider on the rug. Someone's dog stole a dinner roll off the counter. It was everything my childhood Christmases weren't: unpolished, unposed, real. We wore pajamas and mismatched socks, not sequin dresses. We played board games. We shared stories. No one asked about resumes or GPAs or success. No one compared siblings. No one performed. Midway through the night, One of the younger guests, a quiet 20-year-old whose parents had refused to speak to him after he left college, pulled me aside. His voice shook when he said, "Sometimes I think I'm the disappointment of my family. Like I ruined everything just by being me." Something inside me softened, something deep and old and still healing. I smiled gently. "Can I tell you something?" He nodded. "I used to think the same thing. For a long time. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step out of the role they forced on you. You're not a disappointment. You're just writing a script they never imagined." I was low kitten any day. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears, and I felt something inside me settle, like finally exhaling a breath held for 2 decades. Later that night, when the guests had left and the apartment was a comfortable mess of empty mugs and rumpled blankets, I stood by the little tree Eli and I had decorated together. The lights blinked softly, warm rather than dazzling, and I felt a gentle weight around my waist as Eli slid his arms around me from behind. "You okay?" he murmured into my hair. I leaned back against him, letting the quiet wrap around us. "Yeah," I whispered. "I think I am." We stood there, looking at the simplest Christmas tree I'd ever had, and the first one that felt like mine. No themes. No matching ornaments. Just memories, doodads, and a few clay ornaments I had made during a pottery class. "This feels different," I said. Eli kissed my temple. "It feels like home." And it did. For the first time in my life, it truly did. As I looked around my little apartment, soft lights, unposed photos, the faint scent of cinnamon still lingering, I realized something profound. Christmas no longer belonged to the Reed family narrative. It no longer meant shrinking myself to fit the shape they needed. It no longer meant being the disappointment, the background character, the not quite enough daughter. It belonged to me, to the life I rebuilt, to the people I welcomed in, to the voice I finally allowed myself to have. And if you're hearing my story from somewhere far from Boston, maybe in a quiet apartment, maybe in a crowded subway, maybe at a table where you feel alone even with people around you, I want you to know this. If someone has ever told you that you're the disappointment of your family simply because you refuse to be their shadow, hear me when I say, you are not a failure. You are not the problem. You are not the role they cast you in. You're just writing a new script, one that belongs solely, powerfully, beautifully to you. And before this story ends, tell me something. Where are you listening from? What city? What hour? What little corner of the world are you in? I want to know how far this tiny journey has traveled. So neither of us forgets that no one heals alone.